Hello. It's Tuesday, which means apparently it's book tag day. And that's exciting because for me, every day is book tag day. So this tag is genre-ly speaking. Get it? It's a pun. Which is books essentially that are do things that genre fiction does, but they're not in that genre. This was originally created by Criminali, and I got this from Cliff's Dark Gems, so I'm going to tag both of them. Go check them out. All right, so I'm going to start quickly, and I'll kind of explain why I think they fit, even if they're not in these genres. So the first one is a horrifying book that isn't horror. And so I picked Living Dead Girl by Elizabeth Scott. I think I've talked about this in another video, but essentially this is about a girl who is kidnapped and abused by this man, and then she's getting too old for his taste, so he's having her help him find his next victim. It's incredibly dark. One of the most disturbing books I've ever read. It's not horror. I mean, technically, it's more just contemporary fiction, but obviously quite horrifying. So I would say this is probably honestly more terrifying than any horror novel I've ever read either, just because it's so disturbing. But yeah, not a horror novel, definitely horrifying though. Highly recommended, but again, pretty triggering. Really need to be in the right mindset, know what you're getting yourself into. It's a short book, an interesting read, but I mean, again, it's probably the most disturbing thing I've ever read. Number 2 is a book with a terrible crime that isn't a crime novel. So I went with The Lovely Bones, which is obviously not a crime novel, like literary fiction. I mean, I'd say more contemporary fiction, even though it's set in the 70s. I mean, it's not written like historical fiction. It just happens to be in the 70s. But this is really a story about a family and how they sort of deal with the aftermath of this crime rather than a crime novel. There's not really a mystery. We know pretty early on. I mean, the family doesn't necessarily know who committed the crime, but we do, and it's being narrated by Susie, who's been raped and murdered. And if you haven't read this book, I mean, go read this book. It's one of the best books I've ever read. But not a crime novel, definitely not crime fiction, but obviously very centered around a crime, and a pretty terrible crime. I mean, one of the worst. All right, so 3 is a book about love that isn't a romance. And so I just read The Arc of Just Another Missing Person by Gillian McAllister, and this is crime fiction. It's a mystery thriller, but very, very strong themes of like the love between a parent and their child. And there's a lot of that goes on in here. It's that's I would say a key part of this book. And so even though it's obviously not a romance novel by any means, interesting because it's really about love, and your willingness to essentially do anything. There's a detective, and her daughter has some secrets, and then there's also the parent of a missing person, and then the parent of a suspect. And so it's really intriguing because you're getting multiple perspectives, and they're all kind of connected around these crimes. But it's, essentially like all of them are parents, and, it's like, do you turn your kid in if they're a suspect, if you think that they might have committed a crime, if, how far are you going to go if your child is kidnapped? So very much a story about love and the love of a parent. So that fits that one. Number 4, a book with a puzzle that isn't a mystery. And I'm going with my favorite. Obviously, I'm thinking of Ending Things. This is very much surrounded, one of the key elements of this story is there's a question that needs to be answered. And the girl is getting calls and like voicemails, and it's like there's only one question to answer, and you're kind of the whole time trying to figure out what is the question and what's going on. Not a mystery. This is a weird book anyway. Like, it doesn't, in terms of genre, I don't really feel like it has a genre. It's definitely, I think it's literary fiction. But it's kind of horror, kind of a mystery, kind of a lot of things, but it's not a horror novel and it's not a mystery. So, but it is puzzling. And so I think, and there's a puzzle to kind of solve as you kind of progress through the story. And so that is my pick for that one. And then number 5, a book with magic that isn't a fantasy. So I'm going to go with The Change by Kirsten Miller. And I mean, it's kind of magical realism, so it's a little fantasy, but I mean, I think this is more of like a crime thriller that just happens to have some other elements. And so we have a character who essentially is a witch. But, it's more like traditional witch, like herbal remedies and, plants that can cause certain things. But there's like a magical realism element to it. So there's definitely some magic, but it's not it's not like a traditional magic model, and it's not a fantasy novel. Again, fantasy elements, but not a fantasy novel. I think other than I'm thinking of ending things, a lot of my books so far are about like crimes against women. This is kind of I'm a big fan of books about crimes against women, which I know sounds ridiculous. Obviously, I don't like crimes against women, but I am I really like when writers kind of talk about that, because I think, unfortunately, I think women go through a lot of things, and there's a lot of like abuse of women in our society, unfortunately. And so it's always kind of good because there's always different approaches, but often especially when they're written by women, I think they do a really good job of kind of putting into perspective why some of these crimes are allowed to continue, how we kind of have like a social sort of allowance, I guess, for crimes, especially against like young women or women of color. And so, I guess that's why these are a lot of my books. But all right, so number 6 is a book that thrilled you that isn't a thriller. So I'm going to go with The Spear Cuts Through Water, because I was just like really excited to keep reading this. I just found it so exciting and engaging, and it's not a thriller, it's a, fantasy folklore novel. But I was super into it, super excited by it. And if you haven't read this, go read this. It's beautiful. Could have used it for a book about love that's not a romance as well, but go check this book out. I'm not a big fantasy reader, and I was like starting to think I didn't like fantasy at all. And then I read this and was like, okay, yep, that's not the problem. It's just I'm obviously particular about what I like in terms of fantasy. And the last one is 7, a book with science that isn't science fiction. And so I just finished The Ark of Whalefall by Daniel Krauss, and this is definitely a science book. Like, I thought it was going to be science fiction, but it's really just about a diver who was eaten by a sperm whale, and then like how he survives it. I mean, there's obviously some there's other elements to it. It's not science in terms of it's not nonfiction, but it's definitely, I thought it would be like science fiction, but this is really just basically what would plausibly happen if you were eaten by a sperm whale. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure none of us know because none of us have been eaten by sperm whales, but I thought it would be like sort of have these like fantastical elements, but it was very, very like sciencey. And it was just like, this is what would happen. And, so I learned a lot about like marine life reading this book. It was not what I was expecting though. So like, if you're going into this thinking it's like a sci-fi fantasy kind of thing, it's really essentially a book about like trauma and relationship between a father and son and marine biology and oceanography and diving. So very much not what I was expecting, but yeah, the science, like I think, you can tell, he obviously did a ton of research and he knows, I don't know if he's maybe not a diver or an oceanographer, but he obviously didn't like just kind of throw this idea out there. He did a lot of research into, the science behind it. So those are my, 7 books that are outside genre that kind of have like genre elements. And have you read any of these? What did you think of them? If you haven't read them, most of these are books I really, really love, so you should totally go read them and let me know what you think. All right. And I'll probably be back with a tag next Tuesday, but maybe I'll even have another one before then because I like book tags, but maybe not. All right. Bye.